Hey class, in this video I'm going to be going over some more advanced Illustrator techniques. This week, this is going to be the first video for this week. We are going to finish up our digital imaging project, our self-portrait project this week. So I have two more videos. In this one, I'm just going to go over some advanced Illustrator techniques, as I mentioned, and then I'll have another video where I just go over the process of submitting the assignment. So I'll review exporting the images from Photoshop and Illustrator, adding them into an OpenLab post, and then I'll talk about creating your submission and then submitting all the files. But that'll be in the second video. In this one, I'm going to go over a couple of kind of more advanced techniques in Illustrator that you might be interested in using to kind of enhance your Illustrator self-portrait. So we went over some of the basics last time, and now we're going to go over a few more techniques. So let's go over what we'll be doing. So we're going to start with some basic text. So we'll kind of go over how to add text into your Illustrator document. I'm going to talk about the objects builder. This might not be exact same order. We'll look at some gradients, and we'll look at some filters, and maybe we'll look at blend shapes. These are just a few examples. There's actually obviously tons of crazy stuff you can do in Illustrator that we, again, don't have time to cover because we're just kind of doing these quick, shallow dives into each one of these topics. But for this one, I think these are a few good things that will be useful to kind of enhance your project. So these are the ones I'll go over. I might go over text and then gradients and then object builder. Maybe we'll go like this: gradients, filters, object builder, blend shapes. I think that'll be good. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into Illustrator. So I started this self-portrait last time, self-portrait.ai. So I'm just going to click on that to open it up. And we can see I've got my layers here. Oh, I have my gradient panel open from earlier. I'm just going to close that out. But I've got my layers up here. Let's go into this view. So I've got my layers here. I've got my properties here, and then I've got my shapes and stuff here. So I'm going to simplify this just a little bit. I'm not super into these two shapes. I just kind of added those randomly, but let's leave the rest of this here. But let's add some text in here. So I'm going to hide this for a second and add a new layer. I'm just going to lock these guys. And so I'm just going to go over adding some text, because you might want to add some text. We didn't actually cover this with Photoshop, but you can do this with either program. So if I want to add some text, I can grab the type tool, which is this T over here. And then I can just make a box on the screen, and it's going to fill in some random text. It's very small. So we're going to use the properties over here to kind of change the way it looks. So let's go ahead and make it larger. So that 72 is the largest size that is available in this kind of drop down, but I can also go in and change this to like 100 or something like that. And you can go above that as well. And then we can also change the font family in this character drop down here. So we can just kind of scroll through. They have some previews of different fonts. You can install new fonts on your computer if you want to. This is kind of a fun one. Let's see what else is there. Let's see. Quite a lot of fonts in here. Some of them are just characters, so those aren't really going to be useful for us, although you could use them if you wanted to do something a little abstract. There's some emojis in there, some cool stuff. Oh, that's kind of an interesting one. Let's see. Let's go back to kind of like this, the look of this one. This is pretty cool. I'm going to change the text here just to say MMP 100. It's kind of like a medieval font or something like that, which is kind of cool. So one thing you'll notice right away is that it's stuck to the top left of this box. And so if you want to align the text a little bit better, what you can do is first we want to make the box as large as my canvas. I'm just going to grab the edges of this box and kind of drag it out to the size of the canvas. It doesn't have to be the size of the canvas, but that's just kind of an easy way to use the centering. So once I have that, if I click on the center in the paragraph and then the area type, I can center that text if I want. It's not actually centered vertically, so if I want it to be centered vertically, I can drag this box all the way down to the bottom and then all the way up to the top. So now it's kind of centered vertically. You might not need it to be centered, but that's something that you might want to do. So that's how you would do it. We can also change, we only have regular with this font. So some fonts, let's go to another font just for a second to see this. So if we had like this source code font, you have some other options in terms of the font weight. And this kind of changes how thick the font lines are. I kind of like those O's. It's like little eyeballs. It's kind of cool. And so yeah, you can change kind of how thick the font is and other aspects like that. So you might want to try something like that. So that looks pretty good. Let's do maybe right there. And then let's increase the size a little bit more. Let's do like 140. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I might even increase it even more. Let's do 160. Okay. So a couple of things to note about our font. So I can, as long as I can edit the text, I'm not going to be able to treat this as a regular shape. So for example, if I try to like pull on one of these corners of like my P or something like that, it's not going to let me do that. So if I want to be able to edit the text, I'm not going to be able to change the actual like paths of the graphic. If you are done with the text and you know that you don't need to edit anymore, but you want to like move stuff around a little bit or change things individually, what you need to do is change it into a path. So before I do that, I'm just going to duplicate this layer so I don't lose this in case I want to redo this later. And I'm just going to turn the eyeball off on that one and lock it. And then I'll grab this new one and I'll just go to Object and I can click on Expand. And that's going to give me the option to turn this into a path, which I can edit. So I'm just going to click OK. And so notice now I have these little path things. This green is kind of hard to see, so I'm actually going to change the color of this layer. Can I do that? I'm going to go to Layer Options. Let's choose something a little easier to see. I'll do Violet. Okay, it's a little better. Okay. So now if I want to grab one of the edges here and play around with it, I can do that. And I'm gonna get some kind of interesting results because it's still part of this like group. But that will allow me to kind of move stuff around. And if we go into our group that gets created here and open this up, you can see all the different paths. So there's a compound path for each letter. So if I click on these little circles, it'll click on, or it'll select those for me. So say I want to make this look like you know, a couple of eyes. Maybe I can move the O over, and that looks kind of fun. And there we go. So now I can move the text around. So again, if you want to be able to edit the graphics of the text, you can expand it into a compound path and it'll group it together. And then you can do different stuff with it. Of course, as I mentioned, if you if you want to edit the text later, you lose the ability to do that. So that's why you want to keep a copy of it there. Okay, so now that we have this text, let's go to our next topic. Let's talk about gradients. So we talked about adding a fill and a stroke. That's, you know, relatively easy to do, but we can also add gradients if we want. And if we have a bunch of stuff selected, you'll see that I can actually add a gradient to all of them. So let's add in a gradient here. So I'll go to my window and open up my gradient menu. And then I can just click on that and add that to the fill. And this is doing it for all of them individually. So if you have multiple ones selected, it can do that. But you might also want to, you know, set a gradient across the whole thing, in which case you might want to do a different setup. So what you would do then, I think, is grab this with the whole thing and then do a gradient like that. or that's going to do individual ones. You might have to like join these or something like that. Anyway, let's just go ahead and add a gradient to them individually because that's kind of fun. So with our gradient editor, there's a couple components. So we can set different types of gradients. So a linear gradient just goes from one side to the other. And with a linear gradient, you can also change the angle. So I can angle it down like this. And then you can also move these guys around individually if you want to change the individual gradients. So then there's also a radial gradient. So it's kind of like a circle coming from the center. And then you can draw custom gradients. But let's stick with a linear gradient for now. Let's set kind of a cool angle. And then once you have the gradient, you can change where these colors start and stop. So if I grab on this black and I move it up here, you'll see that more of the text is black and there's just this little white kind of like up area up here. So I'm just gonna hit Command plus to zoom in a little bit. So I can kind of move the colors closer together, although you have to be careful because it's very easy to add a color in here. And then there's also this little diamond up here, which kind of changes the way it blends from one color to the other. So you can have white blending into black or more like that, or if you have it in the middle, it's more of a smooth transition. So you can do a lot of stuff with that. And then if I double click here, it allows me to change the color. So I can choose a color here. I can kind of play around with the color. And then, whoops, how did I get out of here? Okay, I clicked something wrong. Let's go back to here. Uh-oh. Okay, somehow I got out of here. Let's go back to our gradients. Okay, let's try that again. So I'm going to move this over here, double click on this, and then try a different color. It doesn't really like that. I don't. Okay, so let's try that again. So I double click on here, it gives me the color picker. Okay, there it goes. I don't know why, I think I was clicking on something wrong, but there we go. We can choose our color. So maybe I'll choose like a blue, and then for my other color, I can choose maybe like a greenish blue. That's kind of nice. And then I can play around with that. And you can add as many colors as you want here to get different effects. So that's kind of nice. Let's see, let's move this over here. That looks pretty good. And so, you know, gradient is a really nice way to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of color there. So let's zoom out a little bit. So I've got some nice text and I can move this up here or play around with it. Okay, so let's actually move it back down here. So I've got some text and I've added a gradient. Let's go to the next thing that I want to look at. And this thing is called the shape builder. And so this is a really nice way to make more complex shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and lock this layer 3. I'll call this text. And now I'm going to add a new layer. And I'll call this shape builder. Oops, spelled that wrong. I'll just call this shapes. Doesn't really matter what this is called. Okay. So if I want to add some shapes together, so let's say I want to make a shape that isn't one of our default shapes. So I can make like a circle, and usually what I use as an example for this is like a moon. So I have this little circle. It's already got my gradient applied, which actually let's change that. So what I'm going to do is click on this and then change the fill, and I'm just going to let's just use my color picker. I'll just choose a color. Oh. Didn't give my Illustrator the ability to actually read my screen. Okay. Uh-oh. Okay, we'll do that later. Okay. Let's just choose a fill. And I keep getting different menus for this. Okay, now I'm in here. Okay, let's go here. Okay, I'm just gonna choose a color. There we go. Okay, anyway. So we've got our circle. And so if I want to do this, I'm gonna copy the circle. So I'm gonna hit Alt Option and just drag this circle here. And I'm gonna make like a little moon shape. So I'm gonna drag this like up here actually. And what I wanna be able to do is kind of cut out this area. And so that's what the shape builder is really good for. So if I have these two shapes, basically it's gonna be able to look at all these different intersections, and then I can make shapes out of any of those intersections. So the shape builder is this little tool over here that kind of looks like a circle with some lines. And if I click on here, notice that it kind of highlights these different sections, and whichever one I click, or if I drag through a couple, it's going to turn that into a shape. So if I click here, it's going to add a shape here. So look, if I open the layers down here, notice I have my original circle. Now I have this like cutout in the middle, and I have this new shape, which is this little moon shape. Okay, so that's cool. I don't need my old shapes, so let's just delete those. And now let's edit this moon. And so now I can use this, and it's gonna create this path for me. And so it's gonna have, you know, built-in points. And so I can edit these points if I want to. I can edit the rotation and stuff like that. But I'm just gonna leave this alone for now. I'm gonna zoom out. Green is not the best color for the moon, so let's choose a different color. So I'm gonna go here, go to my color picker, do something blue. That's good. So the next thing I wanna go over, so that was just shape builder. That was a pretty quick sort of overview, but that's basically how you use it, and you can play around with it and get lots of different cool stuff. Like if you wanna cut some text out of the middle of a shape or something like that, that'd be a good way to do it. Okay. So I've got my moon. So another cool thing that we can do with our shapes, and you can do this with anything. I could do it with my text or my shapes, but what I'm going to use now is the blend tool. And so I'm going to hold Option again. I'm going to make a copy of this moon. Whoops, zoomed out a lot by accident. And let's bring this moon all the way down over here. And it actually doesn't have to be the same shape. Like you could use a circle or really anything else, but I'm just going to use these two moons for a second. And so then I'm going to grab the blend tool. This is this little like box with two circles next to it right here. And so when I click the blend tool, actually before I do that, let me select this moon. I'm going to change the color because it'll blend shapes, but it'll also blend colors. Okay, so I'm going to choose a different blue, go back to my blend tool, and I'm going to choose these two shapes, and we get this nice blend. And you can do that from a lot of different stuff. And the nice thing about the blend is that it's editable. So I have this like path here, and if I choose my direct selection tool, I can, clicked on the wrong thing there. These two things are close to each other. Okay, so I can click on this anchor, and I can move this around. And so that's editable. I can also take like the original path, and if I use the regular selection tool, I can transform it. So I can move it down like that. And so I can kind of make it grow bigger. And maybe actually I want to reverse this. So let's take my path tool and let's move this here and move this over here. Okay, that looks nice. And so yeah, now we have this kind of interesting moon thing, and anywhere I move this, it's going to kind of update. With my blend, I also have some options. So if I click on here, or if I click on the blend, there's some blend options. I'm not seeing them now. It may have to be when you first add it. Let's see if we can find it. Blend options. Okay, there we go. Blend options. Okay, so we've got these blend options. So I can set the number of steps. So if I do like 10 steps, notice that it just does the number of steps in between the two shapes. So if I move this shape over, you can see those 10 different moons. So that's kind of an interesting effect. They kind of overlap and you see the edges. So that might be kind of cool. Let's go back to our blend options. But if I increase the number of steps, so if I do like, 200, then it kind of becomes this like smooth gradient where we don't really see the differences between them. So that's kind of cool. We can also add like multiple steps along the way. We can do all sorts of different stuff here. I could move my path or make it rounded or do different things with it. Okay, So that's the blend tool. That's a lot of fun to use. Let's stretch this out like this. And let's put this behind our text. Okay, so one more thing that I want to show you guys. Let's see. Blend shape filters. Oh, whoops, I skipped filters. Let's add in a filter. So for this one, let's make a little background. I'm gonna actually move this back up here a little bit. Okay, let's make a little background. So I'm gonna grab a rectangle. And I'm just gonna draw, well, let's actually make a new shape first. So let's lock this, or let's make a new layer. And we'll call this background. And I'll move this down here. And so then I'll grab my rectangle and I'll just make it kind of as big as the canvas. There we go. Okay, so that looks kind of nice. Let's add a gradient in here so we can see this effect a little bit better. So I'm going to choose my gradient tool again. And now you can also edit the gradient inside the canvas when you use the gradient tool. This one is a little bit trickier to use. You kind of have to move around until you get the right. See, if I move right here, I can rotate, and then I can move these points a little bit, and I can change these colors. So it's a little trickier to use, but we can get something that looks kind of nice. We play around with this. Let me see, I keep missing this. Okay, if I grab this, then I can go down here, and then I can rotate if I get this. Okay, so that looks okay, but now what I really want to do, now I've got this nice gradient, I can add some filters on top of that, so that'll look kind of interesting. So I'll go to Effect, and you know from our previous Photoshop work that I love noise, so I'm going to go to Texture, and I'm going to go to Grain. And we're going to get this kind of like grain designer here. There's a lot of these different effects, so you know you can play around with lots of different ones. Let's move this over and zoom out a little bit so we can see what that's going to look like. Okay, so we get this nice grain on here, and then we can kind of play around with this a little bit. So if we do like stippled, we're going to get a different thing. If we do horizontal, we get these kind of horizontal streaks. Okay, there's a bunch of different ones. If we do speckle, I like one, if we do soft, we'll get kind of more of a kind of smooth look. I like enlarge, that kind of increases the size a little bit so you can actually see the noise a little bit. I'm going to turn down the intensity just a bit, and I'm going to up the contrast. And there we go, we have some nice noise in there. And now that's going to apply. So you can see it takes a little while. So if I adjust this rectangle at all, like if I move this around, it's going to take a little while to process that. So the filters take up a little bit more processing power. But so you may want to, you know, kind of design your thing and then turn it off for a little while and turn it back on. But it's a cool thing to be able to use to add a little bit more texture, a little bit less of the kind of like normal lines and shapes, clean stuff that we're used to with Illustrator. You can add in something a little bit more interesting. So let's bring in the face that we created last time again, which looks a little goofy now, but that's okay. I'm going to put this above our moon and below our shapes. And let's move this around a little bit. So I'll take, let's select all of my self-portrait face, move that down, and let's take my text and select that, and move that down here. And that looks kind of cool. I chose very similar colors, so it kind of like blends in with the background, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, there's a few different techniques. This composition could definitely use some work, but I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm just going to wrap up there for now. But hopefully that gives you a sense of like a few different things that you could do if you wanted to add a little texture, add a little more interesting color choices and different types of shapes and things like that. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video for this week, I'm going to go over exporting images again from Illustrator and Photoshop and submitting the final project for our or the final submission for our digital imaging project. So that's going to be due next week, and that's our first project submission. So I'm going to go over everything that you need to do that in a fair amount of detail. So hopefully that will be useful. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can always let me know, and we can go over stuff in office hours or on Discord.